Full story. Abandoned in the wilderness by her mother, Elara fights for survival and truth. Welcome to Silent Wars. In today's full story, we take you on an emotional journey of survival, betrayal, and the power of reclaiming one's voice. Elara's story will touch your heart as she navigates a world filled with challenges, pushing through pain and abandonment. Don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to Silent Wars for more inspiring content like this. Let's dive into her incredible journey. The wind howled through the trees, a bitter reminder of how alone Elara truly was. She sat on the cold, barren ground, her body trembling from both the harsh cold and the weight of her abandonment. The forest around her stretched endlessly, dark and unwelcoming. The silence was unnerving, so profound that it felt as though it could swallow her whole. Elara tried to move, but her legs, weak from the sudden trauma, betrayed her. Each attempt to shift caused her body to scream in pain, a stark contrast to the deep silence enveloping her. What kind of mother leaves her own child in a place like this? The thought echoed in her mind, but she couldn't quite believe it was real. She couldn't believe her mother, the one person who was supposed to protect her, had just driven her into the wilderness and left her to die. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. Not like this. Elara could still feel the sting of her mother's harsh words as she was yanked out of the car. The memories of the coldness in her mother's eyes and the snap of the car door slamming shut replayed over and over in her mind. In that moment, everything she had known, everything she had trusted, had shattered into a million pieces. Her body, shivering and aching from the cold, lay crumpled on the forest floor like a discarded doll, unwanted and forgotten. She had been prepared for tough moments, but nothing could have prepared her for this being left alone, not by a stranger, but by her own flesh and blood. She had lived through enough to know the feeling of neglect and emotional abandonment. But this was different. This was physical abandonment. There was no hope of rescue. No help was coming. Her phone was dead, and there was no one out here. No lights to guide her. No warmth to ease the crushing cold. The thought of her mother's betrayal gnawed at her insides. How could someone so trusted, someone who had given her life, also be the one to take it away? It wasn't just the physical abandonment that hurt, but the emotional one. Her mother had abandoned her in a way that left Elara not just fighting for survival, but fighting for her own worth. What was it about her that made her so easy to discard? The pain in her legs was the least of her worries. With every labored breath, the realization set in more clearly. She was truly alone. There was no hope, no escape. She tried to steady herself, to get a grip on what was happening, but all she could feel was the cold, seeping deep into her bones, the darkness closing in, and a sense of hopelessness that seemed impossible to shake. It wasn't supposed to end like this, but what Elara didn't know, what she couldn't have possibly realized, was that someone else was watching. Someone had seen the entire exchange unfold, and that someone was not a mere bystander. They were a stranger who knew more about her story than she could ever imagine. The stranger stood at the edge of the trees, hidden from view, watching every painful moment. They saw the cruel way her mother left her, the way Elara's heart shattered as she was abandoned in the wilderness. The stranger watched as Elara's trembling body struggled to move, to survive. They could see it all, the fear, the disbelief, the quiet acceptance that she was truly on her own now. But the stranger didn't step in right away. They didn't rush forward to save her. Instead, they waited, silently observing, knowing that what had just happened was only the beginning of a much deeper, hidden story. Elara had no idea that someone who cared, was just out of sight. She couldn't know that the silence around her wasn't as absolute as it seemed. The stranger held the secret to her future, a secret that would eventually unravel the mysteries of her family, the dark truths that had been buried for so long. But for now, all she knew was the crushing weight of her isolation. The forest seemed to close in on her as she lay there, bruised and battered, her body cold and aching. There was no telling how long she would survive out here, but one thing was certain. Elara wasn't going to give up. The fire that burned within her, the one that her mother couldn't extinguish, was still alive. No matter how dark or how cold it became, she would keep moving, keep fighting. The woods might have swallowed her up, but they hadn't taken her will to live. Not yet. Not until her story was told. Elara sat in the passenger seat, her hands clenched tightly in her lap, staring out the window as the scenery blurred past. The world outside seemed to shift from the familiarity of suburban streets to the creeping isolation of winding roads that led nowhere. Her mother's silence was heavy, oppressive, as if it had a weight all its own. The tires of the Jeep Cherokee hummed against the asphalt, but Elara could barely hear them over the rush of her thoughts. She had known something was off, had sensed it ever since she got into the car that afternoon. There was a strange tension in the air, a palpable unease that wrapped around her chest, making it hard to breathe. Her mother had been distant all day, the tightness in her jaw, the way her hands gripped the steering wheel too hard, all signs that something wasn't right. Elara had seen it before, the calm before the storm. The way her mother would suddenly shut down, like a light being switched off, leaving nothing but cold, unspoken rage. "Where are we going?" Elara asked, her voice trembling as the words left her lips. She tried to make it sound casual, but the fear she'd been holding back all day was impossible to mask. Her heart pounded in her chest, a rapid beat that only seemed to grow louder as the trees closed in around them. Her mother's gaze never left the road. "It's a surprise," she said flatly, her voice void of warmth. The words hit Elara like a slap, the tone so cold it made her stomach twist. "Trust me." Those two words hung in the air between them, familiar, yet somehow more terrifying than before. Elara had heard them countless times over the years, each time followed by an action that shattered something in her. "Trust me. Trust me. Even when she left me alone for hours. Trust me. Even when she lied and pretended nothing was wrong. Trust me. Even when she made me feel like I didn't matter." This time, those words cut deeper than ever. Elara felt the familiar knot of dread tighten in her stomach. She had trusted her mother for so long, but it was becoming harder to do so. Something in the back of her mind told her that whatever this surprise was, it wasn't good. It wasn't like the trips they'd taken together when Elara was younger, when she could still feel the warmth of her mother's care, when their journeys had been filled with laughter and love. No, this was different. This felt cold. This felt like a turning point. Like the final chapter of a story that Elara didn't want to end. The tires crunched on gravel as her mother veered off the main road, sending a shiver down Elara's spine. The familiar landmarks of the town disappeared behind them, replaced by stretches of uninhabited land and dense woods. The trees were thick and dark, their branches reaching out like bony fingers. There were no lights here, no street signs, no signs of civilization at all. The landscape was desolate and remote, a far cry from the bustling streets Elara knew. Elara's heart rate quickened. "Where are we really going?" she asked again, this time louder, her voice cracking with the fear she could no longer hide. She wished she could see her mother's face, to read the truth in her eyes, but her mother refused to look at her, as though her daughter didn't even exist. "It's a surprise," her mother repeated, the same empty response that echoed in Elara's mind like a warning bell. There was no comfort in her words, no reassurance, only coldness. A chill ran through Elara's bones, and she shifted uncomfortably in her seat, glancing out the window once more. The car seemed to move slower now, the further they got from the main road. The trees felt closer, the shadows darker, and the silence louder. Every passing minute seemed to stretch on forever. each second adding to the feeling of impending doom that hung over her like a storm cloud. Her mother didn't seem to notice the way Elara was looking at her, the way she was desperately searching for answers in her mother's rigid form. Maybe her mother didn't even care. Maybe, for once, she was finally doing what she'd wanted to do all along, leave Elara behind, without explanation, without reason. The thought stung. It was a betrayal that cut deeper than anything her mother had ever done before. As the car turned down a narrow dirt road, Elara's chest tightened. She wanted to speak, to say something, anything that would break the silence, but the words stuck in her throat. She wasn't sure what she was afraid of, but the unease in her heart told her that whatever was waiting ahead, it wasn't going to be something she could undo. All she could do was wait. Wait for the road to end. Wait for the inevitable confrontation. Wait for the truth to finally break free. The sudden screech of tires grinding to a halt broke the heavy silence in the car. Elara's heart skipped a beat as she jerked forward, her body not yet prepared for what was happening. Her mother's grip tightened on the steering wheel, her knuckles as white as her face, her jaw clenched in that familiar, unnerving way. Elara's stomach churned with a gut-wrenching feeling. She could sense it now, the moment that had been creeping closer and closer. The moment that everything she had known was about to unravel. Without warning, her mother threw the car into park and yanked the key from the ignition. Elara's breath caught in her chest, and her body stiffened, frozen by the sheer suddenness of it all. Before she could ask another question, her mother was already out of the car, her boots crunching on the gravel. Elara's hands gripped the edge of the seat as she tried to catch her breath. Confusion, fear, and disbelief swirling inside her like a storm. "What's going on?" Elara whispered under her breath, but there was no one to answer her. Her mother opened the passenger door with a snap, yanking Elara out of her seat by the arm. The movement was so forceful it caught her off guard, and Elara stumbled, her legs buckling beneath her as she fell to the cold ground. Pain shot up her spine, but it was nothing compared to the pain in her heart. She opened her mouth to speak, to plead, to ask why, but no words came. The coldness in her mother's eyes was enough to silence her, to choke her words before they even left her lips. "You're nothing but trouble," her mother snapped, her voice sharp and venomous, as though she was speaking to a stranger, not her own flesh and blood. "You never stop making everything difficult." Elara tried to push herself up, her body trembling, but the weight of her mother's words crushed her down further. The ground beneath her was cold and unforgiving, just like her mother's glare. She wanted to scream, to beg her mother to listen, to tell her that she was wrong, that she was not the problem. But her throat was tight, and the words stuck to her chest like a lump she couldn't swallow. The duffel bag hit the ground with a thud, its contents shifting and spilling out. But Elara didn't even look at it. Her eyes were fixed on her mother as she turned and walked away without a second glance. The sound of her mother's footsteps was all Elara could hear now, the crunch of gravel beneath her mother's boots the only sound that filled the air. "Mom, please," Elara croaked, her voice breaking, but her mother didn't stop. She didn't look back. Her figure became smaller and smaller as she moved toward the car, her back stiff and unyielding. "No!" Elara cried out, but it was too late. The engine roared to life, and her mother's car, the only thing she had trusted in her life, sped off into the distance. The brake lights blinked once, twice, then vanished completely into the night. Elara was left in the dark, the world around her a swirling abyss of trees and shadows. The cold crept deeper into her bones, and the silence seemed to swallow her whole. She wanted to move, wanted to escape, but her body felt heavy, as if it too had been abandoned. Her legs refused to obey, and her hands shook uncontrollably as she tried to push herself up again. The trees around her were dark and imposing, their branches twisting like claws, making her feel even more isolated, as though the forest itself was conspiring to keep her alone. Her mother had left her there, alone, abandoned. It was the final cruel act in a series of silent betrayals. Elara sat there, frozen, her heart shattering into 1,000 pieces. She had always believed her mother was the one person she could count on, but now there was nothing left. The love she had clung to, the hope she had held for so long, was gone. The darkness around her felt suffocating. Elara wasn't sure how long she sat there, but the realization was finally starting to sink in. She was truly alone. No one was coming. Her mother had made sure of that. But somewhere deep inside her, a tiny flicker of something stubborn refused to die out. It wasn't hope. Not yet. But it was survival. And Elara wasn't ready to give up, not now. Not ever. Elara's body screamed with every painful movement as she dragged herself through the dense woods. The cold air bit at her skin, her limbs heavy with exhaustion. Each breath she took was sharp, like a needle stabbing through her chest. But still, she kept moving. Her legs, weak and bruised from the fall, buckled beneath her again, and she collapsed onto the cold earth. She didn't have the strength to push herself up, but she couldn't stop. Not now. She couldn't let her mother's betrayal be the last chapter of her story. The trees around her were oppressive, their twisted branches casting long shadows that seemed to close in on her. The world felt like it was closing in, the darkness creeping up to swallow her whole. There was no sign of life here, no birds calling, no distant sounds of civilization, just the stillness of the forest and the echo of her labored breaths. As Elara pulled herself forward, a strange sensation swept over her. Something was different. The air, heavy with silence, seemed to shift, a subtle change that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. Was it an animal? The rustling of the underbrush? Or something else? Her heart raced, a wild thudding in her chest as her mind tried to make sense of the strange feeling that lingered in the air. Then she heard it, a muffled cough, low and human. The sound was faint, but it was there, unmistakable. Her body froze. Every part of her wanted to believe it was just the wind, but a part of her, a deep instinct that she couldn't ignore, told her it wasn't. She wasn't alone. Her pulse quickened as she lifted her head, her eyes scanning the darkness around her, searching for the source of the sound. Through the dense trees, a figure emerged, tall and imposing. He stood there just out of reach of the fading light, his face hidden beneath a hood. His presence was silent, yet it filled the space with an eerie calm, the kind of quiet that made every breath feel heavy in the air. Elara couldn't make out any details. He didn't speak, didn't move, but there was something about him that felt different. Something familiar, yet entirely foreign. Her body was trembling, not just from the cold now, but from the raw fear that gripped her. Was he dangerous? Was he another stranger to be feared? Or was this a twist of fate, a person who would offer her the help she so desperately needed? Her mind raced with questions, but the stranger did not speak. He simply stood there, watching her, his posture unreadable. Then, without a word, he knelt beside her, his hands moving with practiced ease. He didn't look at her, but his presence seemed to soothe her in a way she couldn't explain. He reached into his pack, pulling out a half-empty bottle of water. He offered it to her without hesitation, his hand outstretched. Elara stared at it for a moment, unsure if she could trust this stranger. But her thirst, the gnawing hunger inside her, overcame the caution in her mind. She took the water from his hand, her fingers trembling as she drank deeply. As she drank, the stranger didn't speak. His silence was comforting in its own way, a quiet assurance that somehow she wasn't completely alone in the world. The warmth of the water spread through her, and for the first time since she had been abandoned, Elara felt a flicker of hope stir inside her, a small, fragile thing, but enough to make her believe that maybe, just maybe, there was someone out there who still cared. He didn't offer her much, just water, warmth, and a moment of solace in the midst of her suffering. But in that moment, that brief moment of connection, Elara understood something. She wasn't invisible. She wasn't forgotten. There was still a sliver of light in the darkness, and for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to believe that she could survive this. The stranger didn't wait for her thanks. He stood, pulled his hood tighter, and disappeared back into the shadows of the forest, leaving Elara with a strange sense of peace that she hadn't felt in a long time. The fire of survival inside her burned a little brighter, fueled by the quiet kindness of a stranger who had shown her that sometimes, even in the darkest places, we are not entirely alone. The cold had wrapped around Elara like a suffocating blanket, its bite sharp and unforgiving. She huddled under the old deer stand, her back pressed against the rough wood, trying desperately to keep warm. The wind howled through the trees, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and decay. The air seemed to carry a promise of more suffering, each gust reminding her that she was far from safety, far from the warmth of home. But it wasn't just the cold that gnawed at her. It wasn't just the excruciating pain in her legs, where the bruises and cuts from her fall had begun to throb in time with her heartbeat. It was something much deeper, something that went far beyond her physical wounds. She had been abandoned, left to die by the one person who should have protected her. Her mother. The woman who had once whispered promises of love and care, the one who had told her to trust, had now erased her from the family narrative like she never mattered. Elara could still hear her mother's words ringing in her ears, cold and biting. "You're nothing but trouble." The pain in her legs was unbearable, but the pain in her chest, this aching, gnawing emptiness that had been growing inside her since that fateful moment in the woods, was even worse. Every breath she took felt weighted with the burden of betrayal. How could they do this to her? How could her own flesh and blood just turn their backs on her, leaving her to rot in this wilderness with nothing but the cold and her thoughts for company? She stared into the dying embers of the small fire she had managed to start earlier, the orange glow fading into dull gray. The warmth it had provided was already slipping away, replaced by the deeper chill of the night creeping in. The last remnants of heat drifted into the air, leaving Elara feeling colder than ever. Her arms wrapped tighter around herself, but no amount of body heat could quell the storm inside her heart. As the fire burned out completely, she realized that this wasn't just about survival. Yes, her body was weak, and yes, the world around her seemed intent on swallowing her whole. But something far more dangerous had taken root in her mind. The isolation, the betrayal, the lies. These were the real threats now. The fire had been her physical lifeline, but her mind? It was the battleground. She wasn't just fighting for warmth, for food, or for a place to rest her head. She was fighting for something much more vital. Her story. Her existence. For too long she had been erased, made invisible by the people who were supposed to love her, who had twisted the truth to fit their narrative. But in this moment, alone in the woods, she realized something profound. The world could try to take her life, her dignity, but it could never take her story. Her mother had tried to rewrite the ending, to silence her, but Elara wasn't going to let it happen. Not anymore. She wasn't just fighting to stay alive. She was fighting to reclaim her voice, to make sure that no matter what, her story would be told. The cold wind continued to whip through the trees, but Elara no longer felt it the same way. The fire inside her had shifted. It wasn't just about surviving anymore, it was about remembering who she was. She wasn't just a victim. She was a survivor. And she would make sure the world knew it. Back at home, Elara's mother wore the mask of the perfect parent. She sat at the kitchen table, her fingers delicately wrapped around a glass of wine, the same glass she used to hold during family dinners that now felt like distant memories. Her smile was flawless, rehearsed, as she spoke with an air of casual indifference to her daughter, Cresa, who was sitting across from her. "She ran off again," Elara's mother said, her voice light and unaffected, as though she were discussing a minor inconvenience, like a misplaced phone or a forgotten appointment. "You know how she gets." Cresa, too, wore her own mask. She didn't look up from her phone as she nodded in agreement. Her eyes were focused on the screen, her expression blank. A perfect mirror of the world they had created together, a world where Elara was the troublemaker, the one who caused problems. It was easier this way. It was easier to let the story be rewritten, to make Elara the villain, the one who couldn't be trusted, the one who was always making things harder than they needed to be. "No one ever knows what's going on with her," Cresa replied absent-mindedly, her voice flat. She scrolled through her phone with practiced disinterest, as if Elara's disappearance didn't matter in the slightest. The words stung Elara's ears, though she wasn't there to hear them. But in her mind, she could hear them clearly, the casual dismissal, the way her mother's betrayal was being swept under the rug as though it were a simple misunderstanding, a family inconvenience that could be easily explained away. Elara wasn't missing. She wasn't even a problem anymore. She had simply been discarded, a burden no longer worth carrying. It was as though she never existed to them, and that truth so quietly spoken, so casually ignored, felt like 1,000 shards of glass cutting through her heart. The world she had once known, the family she had clung to, was nothing more than a lie. Every smile, every hug, every word from her mother had been part of a performance, a facade that crumbled the moment Elara no longer fit into the perfect image they had carefully cultivated. No one questioned it. No one thought to wonder where she was, what had really happened. It didn't matter that she had been left alone, abandoned in the woods with nothing but a duffel bag and the broken promise of a mother's love. It didn't matter that Elara was fighting for her life in the wilderness, struggling to survive in the cold, the pain, the emptiness of being utterly alone. Number to them, Elara was just a problem that had been solved. Her absence was nothing more than a footnote in the story they were telling. The family portrait had been rearranged, and she no longer fit the picture. Elara's heart ached with the realization. They had made her invisible. They had erased her, turning her into the problem they could dismiss, the one who had been too much for them to deal with. And it was easier this way. It was easier to pretend she was just a lost cause, someone who had simply run away, a troublemaker no one had to care about. But Elara knew the truth, even if no one else did. She wasn't gone. She wasn't lost. She was still here, still breathing, still fighting. And one day, the truth would be known. One day, her story would be heard, not as the lie they had crafted, but as the painful, beautiful truth it had always been. Elara sat alone, her body trembling from both the cold and the weight of the realization that had been slowly creeping up on her. The wind howled through the trees, carrying with it the bitter chill that pierced through her clothes, but it was the deep ache in her chest that gnawed at her the most. She clutched the handkerchief tightly, the green fabric soft against her raw fingers, the last piece of comfort from her sister, Cresa. It had been a long time since she had seen that handkerchief, and yet it was the one thing she could hold on to now, her sister's only gesture of care, one of the last things that had come from someone who had once been there for her. Elara ran her fingers over the fabric, a strange comfort flooding her as she remembered the quiet moments they had shared. But as the wind bit harder and the darkness swallowed the forest, the weight of the truth settled on her like a heavy, suffocating blanket. Her mother hadn't just abandoned her in the woods. It was worse than that. Her mother had erased her. The realization cut deeper than the cold, more painful than the bruises on her legs. She wasn't just forgotten. She was made to disappear. her mother had woven a story, a narrative to make herself feel better. A narrative where Elara was the problem, the difficult one, the one who didn't belong. And in that story, Elara didn't exist. She wasn't a person, she was a footnote, a mere inconvenience that had been dealt with. As Elara sat there, the handkerchief clutched tightly in her grasp, it was like the last remnants of her life before the wood slipped away from her fingers. Every memory she had of her family, of the moments she once thought were full of love and care, now felt tainted, hollow. The years spent hoping, longing for the warmth of a family who truly saw her, were nothing more than a cruel joke. Her mother's casual dismissal, her sister's indifference, it all made sense now. Elara had never been a daughter to them. She had been an obstacle. And once she stopped being useful to their perfect little world, they simply erased her. The tears that welled up in Elara's eyes were not just for the abandonment she had suffered, but for the part of herself that had been stripped away. She wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. She was fighting for her own existence, for the truth that had been buried under years of lies and manipulation. She wasn't a footnote. She wasn't a problem to be solved. She was a person with a story that mattered. And it was time for the world to hear it. She wiped away the tears, her breath coming in short gasps, the sting of the cold finally mixing with the heat of determination burning in her chest. She wasn't going to let this be her fate. No longer would she remain a shadow in her own story, a victim of the lies her family had crafted. She had a voice. She had her truth. And she would make sure it was heard. As the last embers of her fire flickered in the distance, Elara stood, her body aching but her heart stronger than it had ever been. She was no longer just trying to survive. She was reclaiming herself, her story, her identity. Her mother could erase her from their family's narrative, but Elara would write her own future, and no one could take that away from her. Days had passed since Elara had wandered through the unfamiliar town, each step leading her further away from the haunting memories of the forest and her family's betrayal. The cold had begun to lose its edge, replaced by the aching weariness of exhaustion and the quiet hum of isolation. But something had shifted inside her. Something that had started to stir when she saw the small, modest art gallery nestled on the corner of Main Street. It had caught her attention in the way things did when they promised the possibility of escape, something simple, something quiet, yet powerful. Without thinking, she walked through the door, a low bell above it announcing her presence. The space was small but intimate, walls lined with paintings and photographs that seemed to hold more than just images, but stories of struggle, resilience, and hidden truths. It was as if the art whispered to her, calling her to stand within its silence and speak without words. Elara lingered in the entrance, her hands trembling as she clutched the edges of the old journal her father had left for her, now a beacon of the story she had been too afraid to tell. She wandered through the gallery, feeling the weight of each piece, each one a reflection of someone else's pain, someone else's journey. But in every brushstroke, every sketch, Elara felt something within her stir, a voice that had been silenced for too long, a voice that now demanded to be heard. She hadn't come here with the intention of submitting her own work. She hadn't even planned to stay. But somewhere along the way, as her eyes scanned the art before her, a sense of purpose had settled into her chest. This was her moment. This was her truth. And it was time to share it with the world. With a quiet determination, she stepped up to the counter where a kind-faced woman stood. She explained her situation in a few words, how she had been abandoned, how she had been erased, and with a heavy heart, she offered her piece. The artwork was titled The Forgotten Room, a portrayal of silence, abandonment, and the pain of being unseen. It wasn't just a painting, it was her life, captured in every shade of darkness, every burst of color that represented the rage and sorrow that had filled her for years. The room in the painting was empty, save for a single chair, its shadow stretching across the floor like a reminder of the emptiness Elara had lived with all her life. The gallery owner took the piece with quiet respect, her eyes softening as she carefully examined the work. "We'd be honored to display it," the woman said, her voice a quiet affirmation that Elara hadn't expected. But she left the gallery without giving her name, submitting her truth without revealing her identity. For the first time, Elara felt free, as though the weight of years spent hiding had been lifted in a single act of courage. It wasn't until later, when the gallery hosted an exhibition, that Elara's truth finally came to light. As the room filled with visitors, the lights dimmed, and a voice over the speaker system announced the artists behind the pieces. Elara stood at the back of the crowd, trying to remain invisible, but she couldn't escape the feeling that her heart was beating louder than ever before. When they called her name, Elara Halverson, it was like the room had stopped moving. Every person in that gallery had seen her. Her story, her pain, her existence were no longer hidden. As the crowd turned to look, Elara felt a strange warmth flood through her. She was no longer invisible. She was seen. And for the first time, her truth was out there loud and clear for everyone to hear. The truth had been told, and the silence that had once imprisoned her was finally broken. She wasn't just a victim of her circumstances. She was a survivor, a storyteller, and now, her voice could not be ignored. Elara stood outside the art gallery, her heart racing as the sounds of the crowd inside filtered out through the open doors. She hadn't planned to stay for the unveiling, but something deep inside her had pulled her here. Maybe the hope of seeing her work appreciated, maybe the quiet, rebellious desire to witness her truth, finally seen by the world. The evening had turned cold, and the scent of snow in the air made her shiver, but she barely felt it. All her focus was on the reactions inside the gallery, the reactions to the forgotten room, the piece she had poured herself into, the truth she had finally shared. Through the tall windows of the gallery, Elara could see her family. There, in the middle of the crowd, was her mother, still wearing her carefully curated mask of perfection, her face frozen in a smile that was too wide, too practiced. Next to her was Cresa, Elara's sister, who looked even more out of place here, as though the very idea of art, of real emotion, had no room in her world of superficiality. They stood side by side, as if they had no idea what was coming, what had been unleashed by a simple act of bravery. Elara's gaze shifted, moving past them to the others gathered around her painting, their eyes fixed on the image that had been so deeply personal, so raw. She could see the way they responded, not just to the colors or the strokes, but to the story behind the piece, the story that she had lived, but no one had been willing to hear. She wasn't just another artist in the crowd anymore. She was the artist. Her story, her pain, were right there, hanging on the wall for everyone to see. But it wasn't just the strangers who took notice. It was her family. Their faces had shifted as they stared at the painting, their expressions faltering, then freezing. Elara could see her mother's hand hover in the air, almost as if she was about to reach out and touch the image, but something stopped her. The act of acknowledgement, of recognition, was too much. It wasn't the image she had created. It wasn't the Elara that they had decided to erase. This was the real Elara, the one they tried to bury beneath layers of lies and manipulation. A small murmur passed through the crowd, a ripple of recognition that made Elara's chest tighten. She could hear whispers, the low hum of people discussing the piece, but most of it faded into a blur. What mattered was the look on her mother's face. Elara could see it clearly now. There was no longer any pretending. The woman who had once abandoned her, who had erased her existence, was standing in front of her, staring at something she could no longer control. In that moment, Elara realized something she hadn't fully understood until now. She wasn't alone anymore. Her family had tried to erase her, to rewrite her into a version they could control. But she wasn't the broken, discarded child they had dismissed. She wasn't just a footnote in their perfect story. She was a person. She was real. And the world had seen her, not as they had crafted her, but as she truly was. The power of recognition flooded through her like a wave. It was more than validation, it was liberation. For so long she had been silenced, made invisible. But standing here, outside the gallery, her heart swelling with every passing second, Elara understood that it didn't matter anymore. The truth had been told. The lie her family had created was crumbling beneath the weight of her story. And that was enough. The real Elara was finally here, alive and breathing in the open air, her truth hanging on the walls of a gallery for anyone to see. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was thriving. Her story, her pain, her existence had been seen, and no one could ever take that from her. After Elara's painting The Forgotten Room had been revealed to the world, something extraordinary happened. It wasn't just the applause or the recognition that came with it, though both were meaningful. What truly moved Elara was the overwhelming response she received from people she had never met, from survivors of abuse, those who had lived in the shadows of their own pain, and people who, like her, had felt invisible for far too long. They reached out to her with words that broke through the silence she had lived in for years. She wasn't just an artist. To them, she was a symbol of strength, a beacon of hope. She had given them a voice, a way to express the deep, unspoken truths they had been hiding for so long. The messages came in waves, each one more heart-wrenching than the last. They told her how her art had reminded them of their own struggles, their own battles with silence, with being unseen. They thanked her for speaking out, for telling a story that felt so familiar, so deeply personal to them. Elara never expected this kind of impact. She had painted for herself, to reclaim what her family had stolen from her, but in the process, she had unknowingly given others the strength to start their own healing. She read each message carefully, absorbing every word, every emotion that had been poured into those letters. Some thanked her for giving them the courage to speak out about their own abuse. Some said that her painting had allowed them to finally cry after years of holding back tears. Some wrote simply, "I see you." In the midst of this, Elara felt something shift inside of her. She had always known her art had power, but she had never imagined it could carry so much weight. It wasn't just about the brush strokes or the colors she had chosen. It was about the raw, vulnerable part of herself that she had poured into every inch of the canvas. The stories of the people who reached out to her reminded her of something crucial. Her silence had not just been imposed by her family. It had been an internalized silence, one that she had believed for so long. They had tried to silence her, to make her feel invisible, but she had broken free. And now, she was truly free. The real healing for Elara came not from the messages of support or the recognition she had received from strangers. It came when she realized that the silence her family had tried to impose on her no longer had any power over her. For so long, her family's narrative had defined her, making her the problem, the difficult one, the person whose existence didn't matter. But no longer. Her truth was out there, her voice was heard, and it resonated with others who had also been silenced. She was no longer bound by their lies. She was no longer shackled by the expectations they had placed on her, by the way they had tried to erase her from the story. Elara had taken control of her own narrative. She had taken her pain, her suffering, and turned it into something powerful, into a story that could not be ignored. Her journey wasn't over, of course. Healing, she realized, was never a straight path. But with every new message, with every new person who reached out to thank her for her art, Elara knew that she was no longer the broken, abandoned girl in the woods. She was a survivor. She was a storyteller. And most importantly, she was free. The silence that had once imprisoned her had been shattered. And in its place, a new voice emerged, the voice of someone who had not only survived, but had come out stronger, braver, and ready to help others find their own strength. Elara's healing had begun, and it was far more powerful than she had ever imagined. She wasn't just healing for herself, she was helping others heal too. And in that way, her art had become more than just a reflection of her pain. It had become the bridge that connected her to the world, to people who needed to hear the story she had so long kept hidden. It was a ripple effect that would continue to grow, spreading light in the darkness, one voice at a time. As the days passed and the echoes of her family's rejection grew fainter, Elara found herself standing at a crossroads in her life. The weight of the past, of the years spent silenced and hidden, had become lighter with each passing moment. But it was still there, lingering like a shadow she could never quite shake off. She had come a long way from the cold, lonely forest where she had been abandoned, and the journey had changed her. But the hardest part, the part that still challenged her every day, was letting go of the past, the people, the lies, and the pain that had once defined her. She had spent so many years waiting for an apology, for someone to acknowledge the hurt, the betrayal, the erasure of her existence. She had hoped that one day her mother would see her, truly see her, and regret the decisions that had almost broken her. She had longed for Cresa, her sister, to recognize the injustice, to reach out and offer her the support that had been withheld for so long. But as time passed, Elara began to realize something profound. Healing doesn't always come with an apology. Sometimes it comes the moment we stop waiting for one. Elara had spent so much of her life seeking validation from the very people who had tried to break her. She had lived in the shadow of their rejection, seeking their approval, their acknowledgement that she mattered, that she was worth something. For years, she had let their opinions define her, allowing their actions to dictate how she saw herself. But no more. The truth was, she didn't need their permission to heal. She didn't need their approval to move forward. The only approval she needed was her own. It was a liberating realization, one that washed over her slowly but surely. Elara understood now that her healing was not contingent on anyone else's recognition of her pain. It wasn't about waiting for her mother to say she was sorry or for her sister to apologize for ignoring her. It was about accepting that the past was the past, and the power to move forward lay solely in her hands. The more she clung to the idea of reconciliation, the more she held herself hostage to the past. To truly heal, she had to let go not just of the people who had hurt her, but of the expectation that they would ever come around, that they would ever provide the apology she had spent so long waiting for. Elara stopped asking herself, "Why did they do this to me?" Instead, she began to ask, "What can I do for myself?" It wasn't easy. Letting go of the past never is. But as she moved forward, she discovered that healing was not about erasing the pain. It was about embracing it, accepting it, and choosing to live despite it. She stopped seeking permission from her family to be who she was. She stopped letting their actions define her worth. For the first time in her life, Elara took control of her own story. She didn't need to be a victim anymore. She could be a survivor, and that was enough. With each passing day, Elara learned to forgive not the people who had hurt her, but herself. She forgave herself for believing that she was less than what she was, for accepting the false narratives that had been imposed upon her. And in that forgiveness, she found a kind of peace she had never known before. Elara's journey was far from over. The scars of her past would always be a part of her, but they no longer had the power to hold her back. She no longer needed anyone's approval to move forward. She had become her own approval. She was free. As she stepped into her new life, the weight of the past no longer weighed on her shoulders. The chains had been broken, and for the first time in a long time, Elara felt like she could truly breathe. Elara's journey had taken her far from the cold, forgotten woods where her mother had abandoned her. The path she had walked since then had been anything but easy, marked by moments of pain, loneliness, and the haunting echoes of a family that had erased her. But now, standing at the threshold of a new chapter in her life, Elara found herself in a small, quiet town, no phone calls, no family to turn to. Just the stillness of the place surrounding her, offering something she had longed for without even realizing it: peace. She had chosen this place deliberately. It wasn't on any map of her past. It wasn't a place tied to the memories of betrayal and neglect that had defined her existence for so many years. Here, in this small town, Elara could start fresh. She could live her life on her terms. And that thought brought her a sense of freedom she had never truly known. The quiet was different from the silence she had endured in her family's home. The silence there had always been suffocating, heavy with unspoken words, lies, and expectations. But here, in this new place, the silence was calm, welcoming even. It wasn't a void of rejection or abandonment. It was a silence that allowed her to breathe, to think, to exist, without the weight of her past looming over her every step. For the first time, she didn't feel like a prisoner to her history. Her decision to cut ties with her family was not made lightly. There were moments, especially in the quiet of the night, when she wondered if she had done the right thing, when the loneliness felt sharp and raw. But as the days passed, Elara realized that in leaving behind the people who had tried to define her, she had found a new kind of strength. She had freed herself from the expectations, the lies, and the stories they had written for her. And for the first time in her life, she could tell her own story, one that wasn't shaped by the hands of those who had abandoned her. Living in the small town was a kind of rebirth for Elara. She found work at a local bookstore, the kind of place that smelled of old paper and quiet afternoons. The bookstore was her refuge, a place where the outside world didn't matter. There were no questions about her past, no judgment, just the soft murmur of pages turning and the scent of fresh coffee wafting through the air. In the pages of books, she found pieces of herself, pieces she had forgotten in the chaos of her previous life. But it wasn't just the solitude of the bookstore that gave her peace. It was the simple act of living without fear. Elara could walk down the street now without glancing over her shoulder, without worrying that someone would recognize her and ask about the life she had left behind. In this town, she was just another face in the crowd, and for the first time, that anonymity felt like a gift. No one knew her history. No one could judge her. She could be whoever she wanted to be. As the seasons changed, so did Elara. She felt the weight of her past slowly lift, the ghosts of her family no longer haunting her every move. The pain she had carried for so long began to fade, replaced by something new: hope. Hope that she could build a future without the shadows of her past holding her back. Hope that she could find joy again, not despite her history, but because of the strength it had taken to survive it. One evening, as she stood on the porch of her small house, looking out over the quiet town as the sun dipped below the horizon, Elara knew that she had finally reclaimed her story. The story that had once been stolen from her, twisted into something unrecognizable, was now hers to tell. No longer would she be defined by the lies her family had told. She was free to live her life, free to be herself, and free to let go of the pain that had once held her captive. As the world around her quieted with the coming of night, Elara smiled softly to herself. She had made it. She had survived. Not just the abandonment, not just the betrayal, but the long road to finding peace within herself. And no matter what had happened before, No matter what had been taken from her, she had reclaimed her life, her truth, and her future. Thank you for watching this video on Silent Wars. We hope Elara's story inspired you to find strength in difficult times. If you enjoyed this journey, please make sure to like and subscribe to Silent Wars so you don't miss our next powerful stories. Your support means the world to us.